Hello, this is Stories from the Camp. Thank you for visiting us. It would be great if you subscribed and gave us a like, and also write a comment. Enjoy listening. In the modern world, when we say dinner, we usually think of an evening meal. A warm plate of food after work. A family gathering at 6 or maybe 8 p.m., depending on how European you feel. But in the 1600s, dinner meant something else entirely. In fact, dinner wasn't in the evening at all. It was taken much earlier, often right in the middle of the day. Back then, daily life was tied to the sun. There were no electric lights, no refrigerators humming quietly in the kitchen, no digital clocks silently nudging us through time. People rose with the daylight, worked while it lasted, and slept shortly after dark. In that world, dinner was not a social ritual. It was a necessity of the daylight hours. In most European households, dinner happened sometime between 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. It wasn't just a snack. It was the main meal of the day. It replaced breakfast and lunch, which were either non-existent or minimal, especially for working-class families. The word dinner itself comes from the Old French word dîner, meaning to break a fast. So technically, dinner was the first real meal after waking up, and not something saved for the evening. The idea of 3 square meals a day, spaced evenly, with snacks in between, that's a modern concept. Back then, you ate when you could, and dinner was often the only meal with any real substance. For farmers and laborers, eating at midday made practical sense. You worked in the fields all morning. You got hungry. So, around noon, you stopped for a hearty meal. After that, if daylight permitted, you went back to work. For the poor, dinner might have been a bowl of pottage, a kind of thin stew with some bread. For the wealthier, it was a full affair with meat, pies, spiced drinks, and maybe a roast animal or two. Even in noble households and royal courts, the pattern was the same. Main meal at midday, lighter meal in the evening. In some courts, dinner could begin as early as 11 a.m. and go on for hours. Not because people were starving, but because it was a social display. The food was there, yes, but so was the fashion, the politics, the hierarchy of who sat where. It was lunch, and it was theater. And what about supper? Supper was what you had after the sun had dipped and the air turned colder. It was lighter, less extravagant, and often served in more intimate company, sometimes just the family. It might be leftovers from dinner, or bread and cheese, or maybe nothing at all. So why did the meaning shift? Well, over time, as cities developed, candles got cheaper, and artificial lighting became more common. People started staying awake longer. Work moved indoors. The upper classes started organizing social dinners in the evening after the day's obligations had ended. Slowly, the concept of dinner drifted into the night, while lunch emerged to describe that midday meal. It was never a sudden change, more like a long cultural shrug stretched over 2 centuries. By the 1800s in urban England, the wealthy were dining fashionably late. Sometimes at 9 or 10 p.m. servants hated it. They still had to eat in the middle of the day. They couldn't wait that long. But the aristocracy could afford to push time around like that. And so the old definition of dinner faded. What was once a midday feast became an evening occasion. So the next time you hear the word dinner, just remember, to someone in the 1600s, you're eating it far too late. And they'd probably be in bed by the time you finish. The word dinner didn't just refer to the time of day when you ate. It also hinted at who you were. Because what appeared on your plate said more about your place in society than any title or name ever could. For the lower classes, peasants, tradesmen, farmhands, dinner was humble. Not tragic, not always miserable, but humble. The backbone of the working class diet was bread. Dense, dark, and coarse, usually made from rye or barley. Wheat bread was rare and expensive. If you ate white bread in the 1600s, you either worked in the kitchen of a noble or you were one. Alongside the bread came pottage, a kind of slow-cooked stew made with whatever was available. Turnips, onions, maybe cabbage. If you were lucky, there was a bit of meat in it, usually salted pork or dried beef, added sparingly, more for flavor than for nutrition. Spices were expensive, so flavor mostly came from onions, leeks, or simply long, slow cooking. Water wasn't always safe. So many people drank small ale, a weak beer with just enough alcohol to kill bacteria, but not enough to get drunk. Everyone drank it, even children. Not because they wanted to, but because the alternative might kill them. Now, if you move up the social ladder, the menu starts to change dramatically. In wealthy households, especially among the nobility or merchant elites, dinner was a performance. It wasn't just nourishment, it was prestige on a platter. Food was served in multiple courses, often 5 or more. But don't picture modern courses like appetizer, main, dessert. Back then, a single course could have 20 dishes, and they were all served at once. There might be roasted swan, peacock, a pie with live birds inside. Yes, that really happened. Not to feed anyone, but to impress them. The bird would fly out when the pie was opened, causing gasps and laughter. Dinner as theater. There were gilded fruits, marzipan sculptures, jelly molded into castles or saints, fish stacked like towers, dishes sculpted to look like other dishes, a meat pie that looked like a melon that looked like a loaf of bread. It was an edible illusion. But for all their grandeur, these meals weren't exactly balanced. Vegetables were seen as food for the poor. Rich people preferred meat, lots of it. Pheasant, goose, venison, boar. Fish on Fridays, of course, the church insisted. But even then, it was often sturgeon or eel. To the modern eye, it might seem excessive. Overcooked meat, too much sugar, strange combinations. A roast beef covered in cinnamon, a fish head filled with custard. But for the elite, the point wasn't to enjoy it. The point was to display power. You could afford exotic spices. You had imported lemons from Spain. Then you had influence. Your food was your reputation. The dining room itself was part of the performance. Long tables lined with silver candlesticks. Tapestries hanging on cold stone walls. Servants bringing in pewter plates stacked high with roasted birds, sauces, sweetmeats, and strange jellies. You might eat with a spoon and knife. Forks were new and suspicious, or just with your hands, depending on the fashion and your status. And in all that abundance, most food went uneaten. Plates were removed and scraped away, not because people were full, but because the next round was ready. Much of it ended up fed to dogs or servants or simply thrown away. It didn't matter. Waste was a sign of wealth. Meanwhile, outside the manor, in some village 10 miles away, a family of 5 might be sharing a single crust of bread and bowl of boiled nettles, and calling it dinner. And yet, both called it dinner. Both believed that this was the main meal of the day. Both thought it natural. The rich to feast, the poor to survive. Because in the 1600s, food wasn't just sustenance. It was the structure of society. And what you had on your plate was your place. A table wasn't quite what you might imagine today. There were no sleek surfaces carved from oak, no polished mahogany with matching chairs. In most homes, a table was exactly what the word originally meant, a plank laid across trestles. Temporary, functional, meant to be set up at mealtime and taken down after. The term board actually referred to this wooden plank, and it's where we get old expressions like room and board. You weren't being promised furniture. You were promised food served on a board. In wealthier houses, the board might be fancier, carved, painted, heavy, but the idea remained. The dining area was temporary. Even in castles and manor halls, large boards were brought out and assembled for feasts, then removed after the meal. The great hall would transform back into a space for business, music, or even sleep. And the trestle table system created hierarchy. The head of the household sat at the high table, literally raised above the others. Seating was by rank, not by comfort. In this world, eating was not casual. It was deliberate, timed, and constructed, literally. The table wasn't just where you ate. It was something you built, used, and cleared away. Meals in the 1600s weren't loud. Casual affairs filled with conversation and clinking glasses. In most households, especially among the lower classes, eating was quiet. Sometimes it was completely silent, and sometimes you didn't even sit. Among peasants and laborers, mealtime was short, practical, and rarely comfortable. In cramped cottages, furniture was limited. A simple bench, maybe a stool. Often, there weren't enough places for everyone to sit. The youngest children might eat standing, or on the floor, or on a mother's lap. There were no long family dinners. You ate what you were given quickly, then got back to work. Even in wealthier homes, silence was expected. In monasteries, it was enforced. Monks ate in silence, listening only to scripture read aloud as they chewed. At noble feasts, rules of decorum dictated who could speak, when, and to whom. You didn't just start talking. You waited to be spoken to. At large feasts, the hierarchy was strict. The host sat at the high table, often in a throne-like chair. Those of lower status sat farther away, on benches or stools, not chairs. Some servants ate standing, in corners, or after everyone else was finished. Eating wasn't about enjoyment. It was about order, discipline, and knowing your place. When you imagine a dinner table, you might picture ceramic plates, polished silverware, tall glasses for water, and perhaps a cloth napkin folded just so. But in the 1600s, tableware was not standardized, and it certainly wasn't designed for comfort or aesthetic pleasure. It was based entirely on social class, material availability, and centuries of evolving custom. For the poor, the table setting was often non-existent. Most peasants owned a wooden bowl, a knife, and possibly a spoon, made of wood or cheap metal. Meals were eaten with fingers or shared communally from a large pot or dish. Plates as we know them weren't necessary, because the food itself wasn't varied, often a stew or a pottage that could be scooped and passed. One bowl, one utensil, one meal. But in place of a plate, the common table had something called a trencher. A trencher was not made of porcelain or clay. It was made of bread. Thick, stale, rectangular slabs of bread, baked to the point of hardness. Food was served directly onto them. After the meal, these trenchers were either eaten, given to the poor, or fed to animals. They soaked up the juices, absorbed the grease, and became both plate and pudding. Among the wealthier classes, things looked very different, though not always more practical. Pewter plates were common in middle-class homes, while nobles dined off silver or even gold. The weight of a plate could be symbolic, and the shine of it was a clear message. You had money. Silver platters were often engraved and highly polished before each use. Some were never used at all, just displayed. Drinking vessels varied just as much. The poor drank from wooden cups or pottery jugs. The wealthy used glassware, goblets, or silver chalices. Glass was expensive, often colored, and prone to breaking, which only added to its status. As for cutlery, forks were rare. They had been introduced to England from Italy, but were still considered suspicious, even unholy by some. Eating with forks seemed delicate, feminine, or foreign. Most people, rich and poor, relied on a personal knife, which they carried with them. Spoons were more accepted and used for soups or pottage. But hands? Hands were normal. Washing them before and after eating was encouraged, but not guaranteed. Napkins did exist, but not always as cloth. In modest homes, sleeves and the edge of a tunic did the job. In noble halls, great linen napkins were folded and sometimes perfumed. And let's not forget the table itself. Rough, wooden, possibly uneven. Dishes were sometimes tilted or slid off completely. And if you were a servant or a guest of lesser rank, you ate on simpler ware, often only after the master had finished. What you ate mattered almost as much as what you ate. Your plate spoke for you. Your cup whispered to your class. And if you had no fork, well, that was perfectly normal. In the modern home, the kitchen is often the heart of the house. Warm, central, filled with light and steam and motion. It's where food is made and served, often in the same space. But in the 1600s, the kitchen was not the center. It was deliberately placed far away. And that simple decision changed the way people experienced food. In large homes, manor houses, castles, even wealthier townhouses, the kitchen was often located in a separate building entirely. Not just in another room, not just down a hallway, but outside, across a courtyard, or attached through a narrow, drafty corridor. Why? One word: fire. Kitchens in the 1600s were dangerous places. Open flames burned constantly, feeding on wood or coal. Chimneys were primitive, and ventilation was unreliable. Grease, heat, and smoke created the perfect recipe for disaster. And so, architects and builders did the only thing they could to protect the house. They moved the kitchen far away. This meant that all food, no matter how carefully prepared, had to be carried to the dining area. Not rolled in on carts. Not kept warm under metal domes. It was wrapped, covered, or simply left exposed and walked across the property by servants. Through stone halls, over uneven ground, sometimes even in the rain. By the time it arrived, the food was cool, sometimes lukewarm, sometimes barely warm at all. And this was simply accepted. To deal with it, people adapted. Meals were often served in waves, not to savor the taste, but to serve quickly before everything went cold. The focus wasn't temperature, but abundance. Better to see 10 dishes at once than wait for one hot plate. In noble houses, servants would line up with covered trays and deliver food almost in parade, trying to beat the clock, or rather, beat the chill. Certain foods were designed to survive the journey. Pies, for example, were popular not just for their taste, but because they retained heat better. Stews could be reheated or eaten warmish. Roasts were often cooled by the time they reached the table, so sauces, thick, spiced, sometimes sweet, were added not just for flavor, but to mask the fact that the meat wasn't hot. The rich had their own version of coping. In some great halls, small fires were placed near the dining area, not for warmth, but to briefly reheat plates before serving. Still, it didn't help much. In royal courts, people ate fast, not because they were in a hurry, but because food waited for no one, and neither did the cold. The poor didn't face this problem. Their cooking pots sat directly over the hearth. They cooked where they ate and ate where they slept. But the wealthy, they dined with distance. And so, in the 1600s, dinner was a race against time. Not time itself, but against the creeping cold of corridors and stone walls. You ate what was warm, and then you ate what wasn't. Dinner was more than food. It was more than a break in the day or a reward for a morning's labor. In noble houses and royal courts, dinner was politics, laid out on a table, arranged seat by seat, and served with a healthy dose of hierarchy. Where you sat mattered. Today, we might casually ask someone to grab a seat anywhere. We have open floor plans, buffet lines, family-style sharing. But in the 17th century, meals were ritualized displays of social order. And the table was the stage. At the head of that stage sat the master of the house, the patriarch, lord, or monarch. His seat was often raised slightly, called the high table. Not metaphorically high, literally elevated. A few inches was enough to separate him visually and symbolically from everyone else. To his immediate right and left sat the highest-ranking guests, nobles, bishops, ambassadors. Further down the table, or at lower side tables entirely, sat the lesser folk, minor clergy, distant relatives, favored servants. The further you were from the host, the less important you were. And everyone knew it. Sometimes guests weren't told where to sit. They had to wait awkwardly to be placed. Other times, they were told, and their placement was a source of gossip and insult for weeks to come. Seating could make or break careers. If a rising noble was moved closer to the head of the table at a feast, others noticed. Whispers followed. Did you see where Lord So-and-so sat last night? Promotion at the dinner table wasn't official, but it often came before the real thing. Even the order of serving dishes reflected status. The best food was presented first to those closest to the host. By the time a dish reached the far end, it might be cold or missing entirely. Servants didn't always refill as they went. Sometimes you just got what was left. This wasn't accidental, it was designed. Meals were a social map, a slow-motion diagram of who mattered, who didn't, and who was on a rise. In royal courts, the etiquette grew even more absurd. Forks were laid in specific directions, napkins folded in coded ways. In some circles, it was considered offensive to speak, unless spoken to, and even then, only about certain topics. The meal wasn't just food, it was theater, diplomacy, and chess. And for those who broke the rules, there were consequences. A misplaced fork, an incorrect toast, a moment of too loud laughter, and your next invitation might never come. Or if it did, you'd find yourself seated far, far down the table, out of earshot, out of sight, out of favor. So yes, dinner was politics, not always spoken aloud, but always visible. The bread might have been warm, the wine smooth, and the fire glowing gently in the hearth. But behind the table settings and the carved roast beef, there was power being measured, in inches, seats, and silence. Life was shaped by rhythms. The rising sun, tolling bells, the sound of work, and then the moment everyone waited for dinner. Not the candlelit affair of modern evenings. Not a date, not a party. In those days, dinner was the central event of the day. A pause in the world. A ritual. A social, spiritual, and physical anchor. For most people, the day began early. Farmers were out in the fields before the sun had fully cleared the hills. Bakers were already on their second batch of bread. In cities, markets were opening and apprentices were scrubbing floors. And all of it moved forward in anticipation of one thing, the midday meal. Dinner was rarely spontaneous. It was time deliberate. In households with servants, bells would ring to signal preparation. In monasteries, it followed prayer. In villages, church towers often marked the hour. The entire community could feel it, the shift from work to table, from movement to rest. Even the structure of work was designed around this pause. Laborers worked with the sun, yes, but they also worked with the promise of food. And when that time came, people didn't rush. They gathered, slowly, quietly, because dinner in the 1600s was the one moment in the day when the world stopped turning. In wealthier homes, dinner was announced by servants. Guests might be waiting, talking, drinking small ale or warm wine. When the food appeared, they would assemble, not all at once, but in rank. The host seated first, then the highest-ranking guest, then everyone else, like an opening ceremony, but for soup and pheasant. In simpler homes, the rhythm was the same. The pot had been simmering for hours, maybe hung over a hearth or buried in embers. Bread was cut, stew was ladled, and family gathered around a shared bowl or board. No courses, no performance, just food, silence, and brief rest. After dinner, people didn't leap back into labor. Not right away. Often they sat. Digestion was serious business, especially in an age when medicine was full of superstition and imbalance. To eat and move too soon, that was to tempt illness. So people rested. Some even napped. Others read scripture. Children wandered outside. Life slowed down before it picked back up. This rhythm gave dinner a kind of sacred weight. It was not just nourishment. It was a pause, a breath, a moment of warmth in a day that, for many, was cold and repetitive. Even the church saw it that way. Meals were meant to reflect order, humility, and balance. Overeating was discouraged, as was laughter. You ate to live, not to indulge. But still, for a moment, it felt good to sit, to breathe, to taste. And when it was over, the table was cleared. Not just the plates, but the moment itself. The quiet was folded away like a napkin. The fire still burned, but the spell had lifted. The day continued, but a little softer, a little slower after dinner. When the sun dipped behind the trees and the last glow of daylight faded from the stone walls and fields, the day didn't end with a feast. It ended quietly, with something far more modest: supper. Not dinner, not a heavy meal or a family celebration. Supper was light, brief, and often entirely forgettable. But in its own way, it was just as important, because it marked the winding down of life, the soft return to silence before sleep. For most people, especially the poor, supper was simply whatever was left over from the day's main meal. A crust of bread, a bowl of cold pottage, now thickened with time, bits of cheese or dried fruit. If there was meat, it was likely cold, already chewed around the edges from earlier. There was no expectation of variety, no imagination involved. Supper was what you had, and often very little of it. It wasn't about satisfaction. It was about getting through the night without hunger pains. A bit of food to help you sleep, or to keep your children from waking in the dark with growling stomachs. That was enough. For wealthier households, the ritual was more structured, but the food remained modest. Bread and wine, maybe a slice of cold game, or some stewed fruit. In the wealthiest circles, supper might be accompanied by music or a bit of poetry, especially in courtly or aristocratic homes. But even then, the food was never extravagant. It was considered improper to indulge before bed. Gluttony in the evening, just like excessive laughter or wine, was viewed with suspicion. According to medical beliefs of the time, eating too much before sleep was dangerous. Digestion was seen as a slow-burning fire inside the body. If you overfed it at night, it might smolder incorrectly, producing bad humors, bad dreams, or even illness. Physicians advise their patients to eat light at night, and preferably early in the evening, long before lying down. This is part of why the term supper endures in English, derived from souper, the French word for the evening meal, but always implying something light, almost temporary. A snack, not a statement. In monastic life, supper followed a similar pattern. After Vespers, monks would gather for a brief, silent meal, often just bread and broth. No meat, no ceremony, then prayer, then sleep. And in noble houses, even those guests who dined late would find their evening meals far simpler than what was offered at midday. Cold meats, candied fruit, a glass of spiced wine. Enough to fill the belly gently, but never enough to disturb the night. Because the purpose of supper was not to celebrate, but to retreat, to lower the curtain on the day. It was the opposite of performance. It was quiet, dark, and private. And when the last crumbs were brushed away and the candlelight grew dim, there was nothing left to do but rest, full enough to sleep, but light enough to dream.